And we're close to 50 people, so we will get started. So welcome to the first grand rounds of 2024. I'll start as usual with the land acknowledgement. So Ottawa is built on unceded Algonquin Anishinaabe territory. The peoples of the Algonquin Anishinaabe Nation have lived on this territory for millennia, and we honor them and this land. Their culture and presence have nurtured and continue to nurture this land. CHEO also honors all First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples and their valuable past, present, and future contributions to this land. So today I'm very happy to present Dr. Mark Tremblay, who is going to give the inaugural grand rounds of 2024. So Dr. Tremblay is a senior scientist with the Healthy Active Living and Obesity Research Unit, or HALO, at CHEO, and he's a professor of pediatrics. He is a fellow of the Canadian Society for Exercise Physiology, a fellow of the American College of Sports Medicine, the Canadian Academy of Health Sciences. He is the president of the Active Healthy Kids Global Alliance, founder of the Sedentary Behavior Research Network, president of Outdoor Play Canada, and an adjunct visiting professor at 5 other universities on 4 continents. He has published more than 600 scientific papers and book chapters on the areas of childhood obesity, physical activity measurement, exercise physiology, sedentary physiology, outdoor play, and health surveillance. So we're really honored to have him here today, and he's going to speak to us on moving for mental health, an individualized approach to promoting child mental health through healthy active living. So welcome, Dr. Tremblay.
Thank you, Donna, and good morning, everyone, and best wishes for 2024 for everybody. So, yeah, the title is there and has been read to you. I've got a fair bit to get through, and we'll try to adhere to the time, so I'll move right along. Here are my disclosures. I've received funding from a lot of different groups and so on. This is there and preserved in the presentation if you care to look at it. I don't believe in this presentation I have any conflict of interest. The most direct funding for this has come from the Precision Child and Youth Mental Health Initiative from CHEO. Some of you will be familiar with this, some not. If you aren't and are interested, there's the email down in the bottom left corner where you can inquire more about it. This is the infographic from the 2022 annual report, and I'll just draw your attention to the mission of this, which is to grow mental wellness in the next generation by delivering population-based precision mental health care and prevention for children and youth. And so it was specifically funding from this program that supported most of what I'm going to present here today. So the objectives of these grand rounds are to review the evidence demonstrating a link between movement behaviors, and I'm going to be using the term movement behaviors quite a bit through the presentation, and that means all of the things that we do in a day that relate to movement. And so they're conveniently categorized as physical activity, sedentary behaviors, and sleep. We can only be doing one of these things throughout the day, and we are doing one of these things at all times throughout the day. We want to look at how those relate to mental health and wellness among children. I want to illustrate the importance of examining the full continuum of mental health from wellness to illness. I'll review for you the Canadian 24-Hour Movement Guidelines for Children and Youth, which I imagine I presented to this group half a dozen years ago, and present preliminary findings for an individualized 24-hour integrated movement behavior index to promote child mental health. So just to set the stage so you're familiar with where my head is at, our changing world is changing us in few ways more evident than how we move. At an individual level, we're sleeping less, we're sitting more, we're walking infrequently, we're driving regularly, getting less physical activity, and spending less time outdoors. We're moving from rural to urban areas, from outdoors to indoors, from standing to sitting, from walking to driving, from active play to digital play, from 3-dimensional to 2-dimensional interactions, and these rapid transitions are challenging our brains and our bodies, our mental and physical health. So the problem that I'm trying to address here is that through lifestyle decay, we're mortgaging the health of our children. And the recent childhood mental health crisis is one example of this. So was the obesity crisis, inactivity crisis, and other things that we're experiencing. So what's the evidence that there has been lifestyle decay and that we're mortgaging the health of our children and youth? And so I'm not going to go into this in detail, but provide plenty of citations here if you don't trust me. So first, childhood physical inactivity is common. You're familiar with this. You read about it in the news constantly. It's increasing, and it's associated with adverse mental, physical, social, and cognitive health outcomes. Sedentary behaviors and screen time are rising and associated with unfavorable mental and physical health outcomes as well. Sleep duration and quality are deteriorating globally and have been for decades and are associated with poor mental and physical health. And children's movement behaviors in general then are out of calibration, and the pandemic certainly made matters much worse. A very recent commentary in the Journal of Pediatrics also speaks to this and provides a slightly different angle, but makes a compelling case that the decline in independent activity, that is ability to roam, go outside by yourself and play with your friends, is a cause of the decline in children's mental well-being. And they provide a number of lines of evidence supporting their argument. So they say that we have reviewed research showing correlations between children's independent activity and mental well-being over decades, across cultures, across neighborhoods, across contexts, across parenting styles, and across immediate conditions of control versus freedom. If you're interested in this area, a very nice paper and new. Now, fortunately, in Canada, we've provided leadership to the world in trying to address this cluster of wicked problems that have surfaced with respect to our movement behaviors. And the first we created the Canadian 24-hour movement guidelines for children and youth, represented here on the left with the visual identity of a stylized 4, showing the 4 speeds of childhood and illustrating that the whole day matters, and adopting a new paradigm for movement guidelines. Instead of each of these 4 movement behaviors done and tested in isolation, they're considered a whole. And I'll talk a little bit more about this in the next slide. But in the stylized 4, you see the 4 speeds of childhood: sweat, step, sleep, and sit. Sweat meaning exercise or vigorous physical activity, a fairly small proportion of the day, so you can see it's down there, but angled upwards, meaning more is better. Step refers to light physical activity, incidental physical activity, the other stuff we do throughout the day that isn't moderate to vigorous physical activity. There's much more of this, and doing more still is good for us. Sleep is the largest portion. We want to have enough, but not too much. And sit refers to screen time, where we should have low levels, and notice that it's angled downwards, illustrating that less is better. And so the model here, and it might seem pedantic, but it's quite important. On the left is the traditional thinking. We all know physical activity is good for healthy development. We all know too much sedentary behavior is bad for healthy development. We all know a good night's sleep is important for healthy development. And traditionally, we've dealt with these in isolation. We've studied them in isolation. We often counsel on them in isolation, and yet they are fundamentally codependent. They exist in a 24-hour period, and only one of them can happen at a time. They're mutually exclusive. And whenever we advise on one, we often neglect to talk about at the expense of what other one. And that's what we try and illustrate here on the right side of the diagram, the new paradigm, that these 3 things exist as a single entity inside a bubble, interact with one another, and are fundamentally codependent. And of course, together very powerfully influence a whole variety of healthy development indicators. I don't know what you can see on your screen, but. Okay, so what are the guidelines? I thought it was worth taking a minute to just speak to these. And these are guidelines for 5 to 17-year-old kids, school-going kids for the most part. So the guidelines state that for optimal health benefits, children and youth aged 5 to 17 years should achieve high levels of physical activity, low levels of sedentary behavior, and sufficient sleep each day. More specifically, they should accumulate at least 60 minutes per day of moderate to vigorous physical activity, including a variety of aerobic activities. Additionally, vigorous physical activities and muscle and bone strengthening activities should be incorporated at least 3 days per week. Several hours of a variety of structured and unstructured light activities should also be achieved every day. And for sleep, an uninterrupted 9 to 11 hours of sleep per night for children aged 5 to 13 and 8 to 10 hours per night for those aged 14 to 17 with consistent bed and wake times. And for sedentary behavior, no more than 2 hours per day of recreational screen time. That's an accumulation throughout the day, and limit sitting for extended periods. And then, of course, because all of these are trade-offs, there needs to be a statement about what are good trade-offs. So preserving sufficient sleep, trading indoor time for outdoor time, and replacing sedentary behaviors and light physical activity with additional exercise or moderate to vigorous physical activity can provide greater health benefits. More details are available at the CSEP website, available there at the bottom. And so when we use these guidelines, and to test whether or not these guidelines are legitimate, we did a number of epidemiological studies to see how they relate to health. And so this is one. I'm going to show two here of many, and then a systematic review that we did to compile them. But so the health associations between meeting the new 24-hour movement guidelines for Canadian children and youth. So this is using a Canadian data set here. And this table, and it's going to be a pattern that you'll see in a number of things. And I assume you can see my mouse when I use it. But these are the different combinations of behaviors, from people meeting none of the 24-hour recommendations to meeting only the individual ones, combinations of two of them, or all three of them. So here we're showing 17% of this Canadian sample from the Canadian Health Measures Survey meets the 24-hour movement guidelines. 11% meet none of the recommendations within there. And so here you can see quite a variety. We've got a distribution, which is good. We've got a lot that we can learn from. An alternate way to represent these is the proportion meeting none of the guidelines, 1 out of the 3, 2 out of the 3, or all 3. And you can see those proportions there. And you'll see this pattern a little bit in a number of the slides. Now, I know this is an impossibly busy slide, but I'll get to a fairly simple story here. So the list of recommendations individually and in combinations is what we have going down this column, with the top being meeting all the guidelines, the bottom meeting none. And then we've got columns here for body mass index, waist circumference, systolic blood pressure, diastolic blood pressure, strength and difficulties questionnaire scores, and aerobic fitness. And if I just draw your attention to the bottom, you can study any one of these columns. It's the same pattern everywhere. When we look at the relationships between these different health outcomes and the movement behaviors with meeting all 3 guidelines, so meeting the 24-hour movement guidelines as the reference, you can see in every case a dose-response relationship, such that meeting all the guidelines is better than meeting 2 out of 3, which in turn is better than meeting 1 out of 3, which in turn is better than meeting none of the 3. So all of the integrated guidelines matter, and you see this for all of them, just not statistically significant for diastolic blood pressure. So there is a strong relationship with health, and the whole day does matter. So in this study, we looked at this same thing, but across 12 different countries, in case this just happened to be some weird Canadian anomaly. And so here we've got the 12 countries listed down this first column. We've got this same sort of pattern of things, meeting none of the guidelines, 1, combinations of 2, or all of them. Again, you see the numbers are too small for you to see, but you can tell that the numbers are not all the same. They're not always single digits. They're not always double digits. There's huge variability around the world and in the proportion meeting different guidelines, such that we can learn from different places around the world. Well, why are they doing so well in meeting sleep guidelines, and we're doing well in meeting exercise guidelines? And can we transfer that information to one another? Here it's shown in the Venn diagram. So in the middle here, you see 7.2% are meeting all of the guidelines, 19% are meeting none of the guidelines. And again, you can see a distribution of people meeting different combinations of the guidelines. And in this particular study, we were looking at the odds ratios for obesity. And so same pattern down here, okay? And this is in comparison to people meeting none of the guidelines. That's the reference group. So meeting 1 of them, meeting 2 of them, meeting all 3 recommendations. You can look at boys, girls, it's the same story. So let's just look at the total sample here. So any odds ratio less than 1 means that the odds of having obesity are lower than among people that are meeting none of the guidelines, quite substantially lower for any one of the behaviors. They're lower still for any combination of 2, and they're lowest for meeting all 3 of the guidelines. So all 3 of the movement behaviors throughout the day matter and provide additive, if not multiplicative benefit. Okay, and so those were just a couple of examples of many papers that we've done in this area. And this is a systematic review that we did to examine all of the evidence fairly recently. Dr. Scott Rollo, a postdoc in our lab at the time, led this and concluded that the 24-hour composition of movement behaviors, so the proportional distribution of them, have important implications for health at all ages. Children and youth who meet the 24-hour movement guideline recommendations generally report more favorable health indicators than those who do not, including favorable associations associated with mental, social, and emotional health. Adherence rates to 24-hour movement guideline recommendations around the world were low, and I'll expand on that in the next slide. And a healthy composition of 24-hour movement behaviors and meeting recommended guidelines is important for disease prevention and for health promotion across the lifespan. So this was a different systematic review and meta-analysis that we did, just published late last year, where we looked at 24-hour movement behaviors, so physical activity, screen time, and sleep duration. About 400,000 individuals in this, 63 countries across, 63 studies across 23 countries. And below here, I've got it sort of divided by age and sex and region. And so if we look at the age and sex, we can see that the proportion of this almost 400,000 kids meeting all 3 guidelines is 7.12%, exactly what I showed you previously on the obesity slide with 12 countries. So a very small proportion are meeting these basic guidelines, which is a concern. You'll notice that boys are substantially different than girls, and that across ages, it's substantially different. So a much higher proportion of preschoolers are meeting the guidelines than children, than adolescents. The other side of the spectrum is who's meeting none of them. You see 19.2%, again, exactly the same percentage we had in the Iscoli study. Boys and girls were much closer, but still different, and you see an age gradient again here. So there is differences by age and by sex, yet our guidelines are agnostic for age and sex. On the other side, we can see it also varies substantially around the world, both the proportions meeting all the guidelines or not meeting any of the guidelines. So we have variability by age, sex, and region, yet the guidelines are universal in all spots. Okay, so I'm going to shift gears a wee bit now and try and convince you of the importance of dealing with the whole health continuum, which this funny figure in front of you is to illustrate using a traffic light type of system, green, yellow, and red. And so we should be interested in the full health continuum. We tend to, and certainly in a hospital setting like CHEO, are focused on morbidity and the sort of right-hand side of this, and in the context of this presentation, mental illness. But we have this whole other range, actually probably a greater range towards optimal wellness, where it's associated with increased resiliency, better flourishing, mental wellness, not illness, increased health contingency should a health challenge come along. And in between here, we have a detectable illness threshold, fairly arbitrarily determined by expert groups. I've been involved in many of these things, and we create some line in the sand such that if a person crosses it, they're ill and they need help. But if they're not, they're well and they don't need help. And so when a particular child is reflected by this arrow, we activate different systems, we treat them, we do things, we get them there, and that's pretty much the end of it. Very little resources, energy, and even understanding is put in to finding out how to get that second arrow over to the third arrow, or even over to this fourth arrow. What is it that makes kids really mentally well? Strong resilience, good flourishing, and we study that precious little. Even in the face of large global megatrends like less physical activity, which is pushing the whole population towards that illness detection threshold. So is more screen time, so is more sitting, so is less sleep, so is less outdoor time, all compressing people towards the line of morbidity. And this is all part of mortgaging the health of our children and youth. Now, in theory, we could have this continuum on a spectrum that we could actually score for movement behaviors or some other things, where 0 would be mortality and 100% would be the greatest possible wellness one could have for the indicator one is looking at. And so we wanted to examine this a little bit and find out what the evidence actually shows on the relationships between movement behaviors and mental health, both positive wellness and negative illness. So we published this earlier this year, late last year. And so here on the left, we've got mental wellness. On the right, we've got mental illness. And to orient you to the bars, so the white bars are positive relationships, the dark bars are negative relationships, and the gray bars are null relationships. And so this is just taking all of the papers that we found and all of the relationships that we found, and it's just aggregating the direction of the relationships. And so you can see on the mental wellness side that the predominance of the research shows that a positive relationship, so an increase in physical activity, is an improvement in mental wellness, flourishing, resiliency, whatever. Same with sleep, same with the combinations, same with all three being even best again. The alternate here is that an increase in sedentary behavior is associated with negative outcomes related to wellness. It's a complete flip when you look at mental illness, but it's the exact same story. So more healthy behaviors are associated with preventing mental illness. An increase in sedentary behavior associated with an increase in mental illness. So exactly what you would anticipate is shown in this comprehensive review of the literature. Okay, so mental wellness matters, mental illness matters. And so we wanted to look further, and I showed earlier that age and sex and region of the world matter. And now we wanted to dig into whether or not race and ethnicity mattered. And this was led by Dr. Diego Silva, a visiting professor from Brazil in my lab, and the associations between suicidal thoughts and ideation among adolescents. So here we wanted to analyze the associations between movement behaviors independently and jointly and suicidal thoughts, ideation among Brazilian adolescents according to race and ethnicity. It was a cross-sectional study from the Brazilian National Health Study with over 4,000 adolescents, split between males and females, all regions of the country. About a third self-reported as white and about 2/3 self-reported as Black. The weekly frequency of suicidal thoughts, if greater than equal to 1 time per week, was determined to be the risk group, and no times per week the reference group. And we looked at the 24-hour movement behavior components. And so here's what we found. The probability of suicidal thoughts or ideation on the y-axis and the number of movement targets met on the x-axis. White illustrated by the hatch line, Black by the solid line. And so very clearly, people that are meeting none of the guidelines, being Black and meeting none of the guidelines was a major risk. This is about a 3-fold increase in probability, such that Black adolescents had a higher probability of reporting suicidal thoughts or ideation, while white adolescents in the group that did not meet any of the movement behavior targets didn't have as bad a thing. But as soon as the Black kids started to meet any one of the targets, the difference between race disappeared. And it continued to decay down for both races as more guidelines were met. So meeting guidelines is very good for both races, particularly good for those Black kids that are meeting none of the guidelines. So this is where precision medicine can start to come in. We have generic recommendations, generic messages for these people, and yet we've got remarkably different potential benefit for one versus another. Here we're showing from the same study. So the reference here are white kids that are meeting at least one of the guidelines. When we compare all of the population to that group, there's a 12% increase in risk of suicidal thoughts or ideation among those that meet none of the behaviors. There's a 3% increased risk of just being Black. But again, in terms of a precision medicine or an individualized approach, when you put these two together, look at the interaction effect that shows here. The overall effect is 4.29, more than 4 times the risk if you're Black and you meet none of the 24-hour movement guidelines. So from an intervention perspective, that is a very high risk group that has very strong probability of benefit by intervening. Okay, so then we wanted to look at disease status. So here we're looking at the associations between anxiety disorders and depressive symptoms. So kids that have anxiety versus those that don't, and what are their depressive symptoms like? So in other words, if there is an underlying condition, is that a nuance that makes a difference in terms of recommendations we should make in terms of the 24-hour movement guidelines? So here we wanted to compare the effects of adhering to multiple movement-related lifestyle targets on symptom severity of depression in adolescents with a history of anxiety disorders in comparison to those without a history. And to examine whether the treatment status or time since receiving the diagnosis of anxiety further moderates the effects of movement behaviors on the depressive symptom severity. Same sample here using self-report data, 4.4% reported having been diagnosed with anxiety disorders, and we use the PHQ to evaluate depressive symptoms, again, looking at the same 24-hour movement behaviors. And so here, kids with anxiety are in the hatched line on top, without below. You can see, again, the pattern. Meeting more movement behavior targets is good for both groups. But in fact, for those with anxiety, this is a statistical difference between the groups here. But by the time they meet all three, the difference between the anxiety group and the non-anxiety group has disappeared. They have the same reported symptoms for depression. So again, a differential between the group, a nuance that, okay, for those kids that have anxiety, and you can imagine a Black kid that has anxiety that meets none of the guidelines, tremendously important to intervene more aggressively with that particular person. A precision medicine approach, an individualized approach we would want. We also see in this same study that initially, up to the first year, there's a significant, this is just of kids with the anxiety, but those that are meeting the targets versus not meeting the targets. So there's a significant difference there. So there's an opportunity, again, a nuanced opportunity for individualized approach with these kids that have anxiety and are meeting none of the targets. If we can get them in the first year of diagnosis, this suggests that we have a reasonable opportunity for improvement, whereas if we don't start until at least a year out, that window of opportunity might have disappeared. So then we wanted to understand what is the optimal distribution within the 24-hour movement. What is the optimal distribution of 24-hour movement behaviors for health and wellness in school-going kids? So and this is a work in progress. We're doing a systematic and systematic review and meta-analysis to dig into this. I won't go through this in any detail. We've got 28 studies included, and I'm just showing a massive aggregation of things here. So in those 28 studies, there are 618 different associations looked at between a different measure of the behavior and a different health outcome. And so these are just showing you those that are favorable associations, unfavorable, and null. And in general, and this will come as no surprise, but we want this, when we need this information to build what we're going to try and build. More MVPA is good, more sleep is good, less sedentary behavior and less light physical activity in general is good. And so this doesn't get into the nuances of the trade-offs. Should you trade off, light physical activity for sedentary or sleep for MVPA and so on? We will get to that. But in general, shows you the directions that we want to go. And these, of course, are consistent with the Canadian 24-hour movement guidelines. Okay, so then with leadership from Dr. Marcus Duncan, a postdoc in our group, we wanted to further look at nuances here by gender. So here we're looking for Goldilocks days, days that are just right, the right composition for optimal mental health. And in this particular study, we're looking at both wellness and illness, as you'll see from the diagrams. So in this study, the purpose was to assess which combinations of movement behaviors were associated with best and worst mental well-being and mental ill health in a sample of adolescents, and to determine whether these associations differed based on gender identity categories. The data source was the COMPASS study out of the University of Waterloo, done on high school kids around the country, sample size of about 75,000. Fairly recent, 182 schools around the country. And we looked at both mental well-being, as indicated by flourishing and resiliency, and mental ill health, as indicated by depression and anxiety. Gender was examined with 3 categories: cisgender girls, cisgender boys, and transgendered youth. We looked at the normal movement behavior compositions of them, the proportional distribution of them. All data were self-reported, and we used a CODA approach, a compositional data analysis here, and you'll see that in the ternary plots coming up. Another super busy slide, and I'm not going to dig into this. I don't have time, and it would take a lot of time. But just to orient you, the top row is sleep. The next row is moderate to vigorous physical activity. The bottom row is screen time, so the 3 movement behaviors. The first row is cisgender boys. Second column, is cisgender girls. Last column is transgendered youth. And so don't worry about reading the text, and I'm not going to either, but just look at the charts, look at the different columns, and you can see differences there, which means that there is difference by gender, that we can do better than a generic recommendation to people, regardless of gender, because there are gender differences across all 3 genders, and they differ between the type of movement behavior we're talking about. So if nothing else, look at those graphs and convince yourself, as I have, that they're different. Those all 9 of those graphs don't look exactly the same to me. Okay, and so to the ternary plots here, and so to orient you to these if you're not familiar with them. So first, up on the top row, we have flourishing. The bottom row, we have resiliency. And then divided by the 3 gender categories: cisgender boys, cisgender girls, transgender. The diagrams themselves show sleep increasing, going down this way, screen time increasing this way, moderate to vigorous physical activity increasing this way. The heat map shows where the population resides, okay? The circle represents the stratified sample. So here, hopefully you can see what I'm pointing to. This is the transgendered flourishing score for transgendered youth. The plus is for the whole group. So you can see that the transgendered youth are further to the right and down, meaning that they accumulate more screen time, less physical activity, and less sleep than the general population. The polygon in red for all of these is the Goldilocks zone, representing the top 5% of flourishing, of the kids with flourishing and what their movement behaviors are like. So this is where you want to get to be. This is where the cool kids from a movement behavior perspective is, and for mental wellness. So you can see that the transgendered kids are further away from that than the overall group, but that in every case, whether you're looking at resiliency or flourishing, the population of kids have a long way to go in order to get to the Goldilocks zone and improve. So every step along this way would be an improvement. Most of these kids, well, none of these kids, because these are positive indicators, are seeing a clinician for their issue. And yet we could be drifting them towards the Goldilocks zone, making them weller and weller and getting them further and further from what is represented on this page. So now we're looking at illness, anxiety, and depression. Same sorts of graphs set up the same way, and really the same findings, where transgendered youth seem to be marginalized more so, have more to gain by adhering to healthy movement behaviors and creeping towards the Goldilocks zone. Hopefully that made sense to you. And so just to summarize this paper, the association between movement behavior composition and mental health varied based on gender identity. The Goldilocks days were similar between cisgender boys and girls. More hours of sleep and MBPA are needed by transgendered youth, but also less screen use. Maximizing time spent in sleep and MBPA while minimizing screen time is the goal for regardless of gender for all kids. And we can even from this start to quantify what a Goldilocks day looks like, at least based on the information that we have, which isn't a 24-hour day, but we have information on 14 hours. And that should look like 10 to 11 hours of sleep, 2.5 to 3 hours of moderate to vigorous physical activity, and less than 1 hour a day of screen time, which is half of the current recommendation in the guidelines. So in a nutshell, the environmental scan showed no instrument exists for a precision medicine approach linking movement behaviors and mental health. The scoping review found compelling and consistent evidence of health benefits of combined movement behaviors. The systematic review and meta-analysis of compositional data analysis studies relating integrated movement behaviors to health indicators provides an information platform for a potential movement index calculation. The 3 new studies that I presented here show clear evidence of variability of the relationship between movement behaviors and mental health and wellness, depending on race, mental health status, and gender. Other evidence that I showed earlier shows variation based on age, sex, socioeconomic status, and ethnicity. And the Goldilocks days for mental health and wellness can be and should be individualized, but they are not yet. So the purpose of our study in the Precision Child and Youth Mental Health Initiative was to move towards a precision approach for keeping the mental health of kids well. So we're developing a novel approach that integrates the child's 24-hour movement behaviors to make personalized recommendations, precision recommendations that get kids moving and sleeping better, to pay back the wellness debt accumulated, to pay back the mortgage. So to do this, we're exploring how changes in movement behaviors are changing the health and wellness of children. We have multiple lines of evidence, including time reallocation and isotemporal substitution analyses to support our integrated approach, such that taking some of this to give to that is better, but differentially better depending on whether it's a boy or girl or Black or white or younger or older. We will use the new integrated 24-hour movement paradigm as a conceptual platform to develop a movement index, a single individualized metric that takes into account daily physical activity, sedentary behavior, and sleep, all mushed together as one thing, and related correlates like age, sex, gender, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, health status. So we're moving from an isolationist conceptualization, for example, the importance of sleep or exercise or screen exposure, to a complex, integrated individual model where the whole day matters and each child matters. This will ultimately lead to precision insights and interventions, management and manipulations for improved child health and wellness. So I want to show you just a couple more slides. This is what we mean by a movement index, what we're going to try and get to. So here, I'm showing a ternary plot similar to the ones that we showed in the Goldilocks Day paper. Because we only have the dimensions that we have, I'm standardizing to light physical activity, sort of the 4th speed of childhood. And otherwise, we've got the same thing, sleep increasing here, moderate to vigorous physical activity increasing there, sedentary time increasing here. This particular one, I'm using estimated ZBMI as the underlying data. And so you see the heat map of where the population actually resides. And here the hatched bar is showing the Goldilocks zone. And notice that it's a zone, it's not a dot. So I put 3 dots in here to show you that there are different combinations of the movement behaviors that can achieve the optimal zone for, in this case, the BMI, and the other ones you saw flourishing, anxiety, and so forth. So it's not one size fits all. We've got to move away from the one size fits all. We can make the size fit the person. And so if this is your patient or daughter or son, and that's where they reside, there's a number of different ways that they can creep towards the Goldilocks zone by increasing sleep, by increasing moderate to vigorous physical activity, by decreasing sedentary behavior. Different combinations can be customized for the individual person. If we had this data, and we can gather it through online reporting or automated wearable data capture, we'll be able to find the Goldilocks zone for an individual, customized to an individual, on the 4 speeds of childhood: light physical activity, MVPA, sleep, and sedentary behavior, and provide individualized recommendations, and in fact, a whole suite of recommendations, because there's more than one way to get to a better behavior composition for your individual circumstances. We've started to develop the app for this. These are just draft app wireframes, which would include the index score, the movement index, as well as each of the 4 speeds of childhood. This could be done by the adolescent or by a parent for their kids. If the parent had 3 kids, they could monitor them. And we would provide visuals as to how they're doing within a day or across days, so that they can see how they're doing, and even they could report their mood. So are they finding a pattern that when they have a healthier day from a movement perspective, is their mood better? And that would provide positive feedback to them. I know there's a lot of detail on here, but I'm also aware of them. I'm out of time, but we can speak to these. So just to wrap up, impact and future directions. Integrated 24-hour movement guidelines are new, they're novel, and supported by a growing body of evidence. 24-hour movements are powerfully related to child mental health and wellness. An integrated movement index of all behaviors has never been developed. That's what we're planning with this project. A movement index approach shows promise for feasibility and acceptability. I didn't have time to present here, but we've had focus group meetings and interviews with youth and parents on this idea and have received favorable feedback. There is enormous potential for this new approach to advance precision health behavior prescriptions for healthcare and for prevention along the whole health continuum. These early findings have already been linked to larger national efforts specifically related to healthy screen time behaviors and mental health and wellness. We had a meeting in Toronto just before Christmas to advance this. So in summary, we're mortgaging the mental health and wellness of our children, I believe. The whole day matters, and we should move to a 24-hour movement paradigm. We should move our focus up the health continuum, preserving and promoting mental wellness in addition to caring for mental illness. We need to prioritize primary prevention for mental health, turn off the tap so that we can keep more seats available in the emergency rooms at CHEO. We should embrace the intervention flexibility provided by an individualized precision medicine approach. We do not have to resort to a one-size-fits-all. We can do better than that with the analytical ability that we have and the computing technology that we have. We can do better, and therefore we should do better. The development of an integrated movement index shows promise as a precision child and youth mental health adjunct to promote and facilitate nudges toward healthier movement behavior combinations and ultimately better mental and physical health and wellness. In closing, I'd just like to acknowledge the CHEO Precision Child and Youth Mental Health Initiative for their funding, and particularly for this presentation, Drs. Marcus Duncan, Corey Kuzek, and Diego Silva, whose studies I showed you along the way. And I thank you very much for your attention. Be happy to address any questions you might have.
Thank you so much, Mark, for that really amazing talk. If there are questions, please let you put your hand up, or if worst case in the chat. I will start off with a question. Well, I'm gonna jump in first. how do you, so now that we've moved to online school for kids, that's like you're over their screen time within, before the half morning even started. So what's your recommendation to accommodate the online schooling screen time? Like, how can you overcome that negative aspect of screen time, but yet it's part of school?
Yeah, and the same could be argued for adults. I didn't do adults, but this whole presentation I could have done on adults, and the same thing. The guidelines recommend no more than 2 hours of recreational screen time. So schoolwork or our work here is not considered recreational screen time. It's very mentally active, and is a bit of a different beast. So so that wouldn't be counted in that time period. Having said that, our group a couple of years ago created global sedentary behavior guidelines for schools and educators, where we promote, based on the best available evidence, systematic reviews and meta-analyses, where we promote a healthy balance of screen time in the education setting. So because kids are working from home does not mean they need to be on screens all day. Same with ourselves, for that matter. There are a number of different ways that you can accomplish schoolwork, by reading a book, by going outside. You don't have to do it all while sitting and so on. So I don't have time to go into those guidelines here now, but they do exist. So everything that I'm presenting would work with the information fed in of recreational screen time. So discretionary time that kids are spending on screens, flipping through social media or watching movies or something like that, not, studying physics equations.
Perfect. And I noticed that someone has put, or Nicholas or Corey have put a link in the chat. So I'll just do a question from the chat and then we'll go to Daniela. So one question was, do you have any ideas on which physical activities are accessible and work long-term?
Well, so I'm not sure where they're getting at in terms of having the kids stick to it. It's something that they like, and for many that would be a variety of things as opposed to one thing. So you want to select activities that children are attracted to, and this is something where I think physical education classes could improve going forward with a little more personalization and individualization in that approach. So for behavior adherence, you want something that they like. In terms of the influence on mental health or physical health or different things, it depends on the particular parameter you're looking at. But in general, you want a mixture of aerobic type activities and muscle and bone strengthening activities as illustrated in the guidelines, but customized to the individual for things that they like. So they could be group-based if that's what facilitates things for a child. For myself, I prefer individual things, and so you need to match. And this is where the whole individualization and precision medicine thing comes in. I've been developing guidelines my whole life with the WHO, with Canada, with many different countries, and we routinely do a one-size-fits-all thing. It doesn't matter if you're a 6-year-old girl living on a native reserve somewhere in northern Alberta, or a new immigrant 16-year-old transgendered boy living downtown Toronto. It's the same recommendation, and it's not harmful. It's just suboptimal. And with the computing technology that we have now, with machine learning, with AI, with the amount of underlying literature there, we can do better. And so optimal is within our sights, and that's what we should be trying to do for every one of our kids.
Great. Daniela, Paul.
Yeah, thanks, Mark, for a great talk on a super important topic. I only half jokingly put Switzerland there in the chat. Switzerland has, with Italy, the lowest obesity rate in Europe, and they are probably one of the very few countries in the world where the population is getting more active every year. So I have no idea how they do it, because I've tried in a study to get kids with epilepsy move, and we've tried in a study to get kids with migraines be more active, and it's so incredibly hard. So I'm wondering how this country manages that on a population level. And then the other comment would be, they still seem to have a mental health crisis. And I know it's not all that easy, but maybe you could comment on that. Thanks.
Yeah, I'm not sure that the information, at least on kids in Switzerland, is as compelling as you say, and maybe a little more anecdotal. The WHO compilation of information does not put Switzerland as the most active country in the world, or show that the kids there in general, a greater proportion of the kids are not meeting the guidelines. So that's one thing, whether or not it's a perception or not. But also, I know from working with countries around the world, having discussions with Switzerland as well, they're averse to a 24-hour movement guideline approach, as some other countries are as well. They don't see the connection between these things. And so the dichotomy that you're seeing, where if indeed they are getting more active, or they're more fundamentally active, yet they're still having more mental health crises, then I would say that is because, my guess would be because of screen time. And the screen time affects sleep time, and the sleep time affects mental health, so that's why I promote the integrated approach for the movement behaviors, because you can pull them apart, but in biologically and behaviorally, they're not apart. So it's fictitious when you do that, because, if you've been on your screen late at night and you're texting your boyfriend or girlfriend or whatever into the night, and your phone buzzes and it's interrupting your sleep, you wake up, you're fatigued already, you withdraw from physical activity the next day, you get down a rabbit hole about, breaking up with your boyfriend, or, whatever's going on in the social media universe. And these behaviors are tied together. So to look just at physical activity and ignore those other things, I think is flawed. And I think when you're counseling a patient or a person in the population, you want to know that full package, so you can say, okay, here's the situation, and there's a number of avenues for us to go and nudge it in the right direction. It doesn't always just have to be, you need to exercise 30 minutes a day, just the end, or you must go to bed at 9 at night and get up at 6 in the morning, or something like this. That'll work for a lot of people. And in general, if you mush it all together, that would be the guidance. But we can do better than that. And that's what I was trying to show with those different studies. We know there's difference between race. We know there's difference between ages. We know there's difference across genders. So and we have the computing ability now to take advantage of that. So why wouldn't we do that?
Thanks.
Thanks. We have two more questions in the chat. So one question from Rob Klassen is a question about more sleep above certain threshold being helpful. Or the understanding is that once you attain 9 hours for school age and 8 for teens, there's no extra benefit. Can you explain the potential benefit of more sleep?
Yeah, I think, and I don't know if JP Chaput or other sleep experts are on the call, but the general feeling is there's a lot of individual variability. So some people may need, and it might be healthy for them to have more, and some may get by actually even below the recommendations and be completely fine and healthy. So I think it tends to be what works for an individual, and aligning their chronotype to their actual routine. So like myself, I'm an early riser. It just biologically, I get up early in the morning, and then I'm tired by early in the evening. And generally speaking, I sleep from 9 till 5. Other people go to bed at midnight and wake up at 8. And that's their chronotype. That's sort of this internal clock that works for them. So I think aligning the chronotype with the amount of time needed, recognizing that will vary among individuals, and which is why the sleep recommendations have a pretty wide zone there. And if you creep over top of the zone, it's probably not an issue if there isn't some reverse causality happening there.
Great. Thanks. And one more question from Heather McDonnell. So how does competitive sports training fit into the precision curve? I.e., does competing on a sports team improve mental health to a point until the stress of competition factors in?
Yeah, that's a good question, and certainly not stuff that we got into here because the sort of population based stuff. But the moderate to vigorous physical activity and the light physical activity that one gets with their sport practice would all factor into this. The goal with a sport team, especially if it's a competitive thing, isn't always, in fact, sometimes rarely, health related. So the Goldilocks zones that we drew there are for health and wellness. In a sport context, you could take a similar process, and your Goldilocks zone would be something more performance related, and perhaps even in contrast to health related, as you know, we know happens sometimes in gymnastics or figure skating or something, that some of the demands are not optimal for health, but they're optimal for pursuing an Olympic medal or something like that. So I think for the average kid, sport participation, it fits exactly within the model. The sport piece fits in the moderate to vigorous physical activity and light physical activity. But in the very highly competitive stuff, it starts to deviate because the focus isn't on public health, it's on performance. Not sure if that answered the question.
Great. Apparently she has no mic, so we can't ask if she's in a non-mic. So there's one more question. So there is a new presenteeism with chat groups for work and school that are constant interruptions and may include gossip or non-work school related chatter. And how do you measure this time that is school linked and discern it from official intellectually active school work time in terms of the max time on recreational social media?
Yeah, for sure. That's a gray zone and difficult to do. So the information, however the information would feed into this. So if it's entered by a person, they would have to make a judgment call. If it's from a wearable or from the smartphone and information it has on or tablet or whatever on itself, if it's automatically downloading, that would have to be coded to the best of one's ability. I think I heard on the news this week that a high school I can't remember if it was on the Quebec side or the Ottawa side of the river, have banned smartphones from the classroom. This, of course, is a controversial thing, has been for a while, back and forth. And so, but I think it's great that we're having these discussions, that children are distracted, their mental health. I mean, to me, as I literally look and observe tweens and teenagers and the way they behave and the way they interact with digital technology and how it dominates their life. It's a perfect storm for exactly the mental health challenges that we're seeing in record numbers. They've lost touch with, at least my form of reality, 3 dimensions, being able to see, smell, hear people and touch them, and so on, and spend time outside and get enough physical activity and a good night's sleep. And the screen time is a demon to most of these things, which is why we had this think tank just before Christmas as part of the Precision Child and Youth Mental Health Initiative in Toronto, with experts from around the country to talk about what we need to do to try and do no harm to our kids with our guidance and our rules and regulations as it relates to small screens in particular.
Awesome. And with that, I think we came to a perfect time. Thank you so much. This has been a super, really interesting, informative talk for everyone. And I thank you. Someone has just asked if the slides can access. There is access to the Grand Rounds link to all of the presentations at Grand Rounds. So for sure, everyone can have access. So thank you so much, Mark, for that really enlightening and excellent talk.
My pleasure. Have a great day, everybody.